Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly podcast. This is our third roundtable discussion on economics. Tonight I'm joined by Keith Preston, who's representing classical anarchism, Sean Gabb, who I think is representing classical liberalism, and then Will Schnack, did I say that right, Schnack?
Yeah, that works. Schnack.
Okay.
Schnack.
And Geomutualism. So why don't we open up with Keith? Why don't you explain the basics of your economic position?
Well, I don't know that I really have a very clearly defined economic position as much as I have a number of different areas of focus and emphasis when it comes to economic questions that I tend to highlight. As long as I have been interested in things like libertarianism or anarchism, which has been virtually all of my adult life, one of the main issues that I have had a concern with is the need to break this dichotomy that exists in conventional political discourse between big business and big capital, the way that or big business and big government. The way that the issue is typically framed, at least in American political discourse, and it seems to be somewhat similar in Europe as well, I'm not sure about other places, is that on one hand, you have people who say, well, the only alternative to big government is big business and big capital, and do we really want to go back to the 19th century and Charles Dickens like labor relations and all of these kinds of things? So the argument is that we need big government, we need a powerful state for the sake of economic regulation and development to prevent the exploitation of labor and mass impoverishment and pollution of the environment and all of these other things. The other side of it is what you normally hear from conventional free market conservatives and many rightward-leaning libertarians as well, and that's this idea that, well, no, big government are really the bad guys and big business is fine. Now, there are varying levels of extremes with this. On one hand, you had someone like Ayn Rand who said that big business was the most persecuted minority in the United States. Most libertarians probably aren't that extreme, but there are a lot of rightward-leaning libertarians and even some leftward libertarians who say that big capital is largely something that we have to at least accept because the only alternative is big government, and big government is even worse. Now, as I see it, the entire range of institutions, big government, big capital, the military-industrial complex, the media, the elite universities, the elite foundations, all these other things are all part of the same ruling class apparatus. They're all part of this wider power elite. I suppose we could say that the corporations are the economic arm of the ruling class, the government is the political arm, the military is the enforcer arm, and the media is the propaganda arm, and so forth. And I think that in order to really attack the ruling class of the state or the power elite or whatever, the first thing we have to do is get past this kind of false dichotomy where big capital and big government are somehow portrayed as being in conflict with one another rather than as part of the same ruling class apparatus. Now, in terms of what kinds of economic institutions I'm in favor of, I'm largely agnostic about many issues of that type for the simple reason that of all of the different types of economic arrangements that there are that I have seen proposed, whether it's anarcho-capitalism or individualist anarchism or mutualism or syndicalism or Georgism or anarcho-communism or Luxemburgism, from what I can tell, none of those have ever been really tried on a massive scale, and I'd like to see more laboratories develop where some of these theories are actually tested out before I would endorse them on a comprehensive level. You know, I would like to see, for example, what a society that practiced anarcho-communism would actually look like after 50 years of doing this, or I'd like to see what a society that practiced anarcho-capitalism looked like after 50 years of doing that. So that's more or less where I stand where it comes to economic questions. And I see problems with all of these different theories. I see, one of the criticisms of anarcho-capitalism that people from the left make is that, well, it would essentially be a type of industrialized feudalism. And the people from the right will often say, well, anarcho-communism would become capital C communism, at least with time, or at least it would develop into the stifling bureaucracy that was resulted in economic stagnation and gross inefficiency and things of that nature. I tend to have a most favorable view towards more middle of the road points of view, like the economics thinkers like Proudhon, the individualist anarchists, the Georgists, and some of the other writers that Will writes about. But other than that, I really don't have very clearly defined opinions on these questions, except for the need to get past this whole big business, big government dichotomy.
Okay. So Sean, what are your perspectives on the economy? I think you're muted, Sean. You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go.
I do forgive me. I broadly agree with Keith. We have big government, we have big business, we have the various enforcement agencies. Don't forget the media and education and the general administration. These are all different branches or different spin-off satellites of the ruling class. And I do not feel inclined to stand up for any of those. They're all in various ways and at various times our common enemy. Let me think, as a libertarian, I didn't come into the ideology, unlike many people did, by studying economics, deciding that markets were the only thing that mattered, and then just announcing that all political power, all collective institutions were thereby illegitimate, and just focusing on a kind of economistic view of life, or almost becoming a reverse Marxist. The vulgar Marxist position is that all the institutions and all the structures of relationships that you see in a society are merely superstructure, and they're determined by the economic base. There are libertarians who take a similar view, but they believe that as long as the government does not do anything, as long as the government does not interfere in the economy, everything will be all right. My own view is that a good society is one in which people have autonomy as individuals and as families and as small or perhaps as extended groups of people, and that these should, so far as possible, be left completely alone. What standard economic analysis teaches us is that there is remarkably little need for the state, so far as we have one, to intervene in these relationships between individuals and between groups of individuals. It also tells us that certain interventions are extraordinarily unwise. For example, it is a bad idea under normal circumstances to control the price of bread. It is a very bad idea to set a minimum price for labor. It is a very bad idea to set maximum prices for rents and for other goods and services. That being said, to come back to what I said earlier, I do not believe in complete non-intervention. I do believe in the nation. I do believe that we are tribal animals and that mostly we desire an identity that goes beyond ourselves as individuals. And that means nations, and I'm afraid it inevitably means states. And there are legitimate common actions, in my view, that a state can take. And so, to use a controversial example, if the state wishes to secure an adequate standard of living for the working classes, there are several things it can do. It can, of course, here I would agree entirely with Keith, it can just get out of the way and allow people to set up micro businesses and get through lives in that way. But some degree of wage labour will always be with us for a number of reasons. And although I said it is a bad idea for the state to set a minimum price for labour, there is nothing wrong, I suggest, in certain circumstances, with the state directly manipulating the supply curves for labour by imposing immigration controls, for example. If you want to raise the living standards of the working classes, do not interfere in the dealings between individuals or groups of individuals. Do not say that there shall be a minimum wage of £8.90 per hour, and anyone paying that, or perhaps even accepting that, is in breach of some law or other regulation. But certainly close the borders and make sure that we do not have a continual wash through the country of extraordinarily cheap, low-skilled labour. So that, broadly speaking, is my view of economics. I accept the Austrian economic analysis that normally no good comes of state intervention. That is not to say that I reject all state intervention as illegitimate. Sorry, I finished.
Okay, thank you. So, Will, why don't you introduce your position?
Okay. My position is very much like Keith's, actually, especially in regard to his criticism. I tend to offer a little bit more of a positive view, or I tend to propose something in place of the state, and that would be geo-mutualism. I'm also a panarchist, though, so I've kind of got multiple layers to my philosophy. Those that relate to me more personally, and those that relate to communities that I might be a part of, and how they would relate to communities outside of that. And so the geo-mutualist position is pretty simple. The idea is that allowing free banking, people would tend to form mutual banks or credit unions of sorts that would issue their own currency, and that the market, as well as the organizational structures of these banks, would tend to push the price of the currency, the interest, down to zero, thereby allowing people in the economy to have access to capital and to employ themselves with it. And then the Georgist side of that is that I suggest that land should be owned in common and the rent held in common, very much like Henry George suggested. This was also found in some respects in Proudhon's work, and I argue that that has an element that can be found in classical mutualism. But that's getting more into my specific views when we get into anarchism. I also think that the communities I'm a part of, or that I wish to be a part of, would have to interact with communities that are very different from us. And in that regard, I'm a panarchist, and I support people partaking in voluntary governments or states, or however they want to phrase it, and not necessarily participating in my particularist kind of structures. However, I do think that an issue that panarchists have to address is one of territorial boundaries and property rights. And I really think that the Georgist position offers something kind of meta to both the capitalist and the communist preferences, and has the potential to be tolerated by both sides, and is a possible means of agreement. And so that's basically my position right there.
All right, thanks. So, coming at the economic questions, I usually come at it from two perspectives: Aristotle's philosophy and the Bible. So let's start with Aristotle. The Greek economy comes from oikos nomos, which means household law, and in the politics, Aristotle describes the family is the lowest level of a self-sufficient institution. It's the most basic level of self-sufficient institution. Therefore, the economy should seek to serve the needs not of the individual or of the collective, which would be the capitalist Marxist extremes, but more of the family oriented. In fact, the doctrine of distributism is largely, but not exclusively, a Catholic economic position. Seems to be more in tune with that intuition that Aristotle had. One of the things that, to some extent, I think Keith and Schott have hinted at, and even Will as well, is the importance of self-sufficiency. You know, made in America used to be, you know, a byword. Now it's made in China. So, and you know, that was part of the old American protectionist outlook. The other thing is what happens when one applies biblical study to economics as well. We see the prohibitions against usury, which I think are, you know, unfortunately ignored. And this is where maybe people on the left can find common ground with Christians, because the Bible, as well as prohibits usury, as well as other leftist thinkers have arguments against usury, as does Aristotle. You know, the idea that as far as property arrangements, I think that the ideal sort of property arrangements would we see are something like what we see in distributism, where property is as widely distributed as possible. And property doesn't just have to be land; it could be any sort of productive property. So that could be computers, or things like that. And the other thing is, this is kind of one of the dividing lines between, say, classical anarchism and on the one hand, and then Christian economics and capitalism on the other hand, is that the whole idea of private property as opposed to personal property. The idea that property that you don't derive, that you do not work personally to derive value from, is illegitimate. While it's not an economics lesson, the parable of the vineyard presupposes the legitimacy of private property, in the sense that the vineyard owner sends his servants to go collect the produce of the vineyard. And it's interesting when you look at it in that sense, what it presupposes to be true for the moral message to make sense. So some sort of fusion between sort of Aristotelian self-sufficiency and some of the intuitions that derive out of that, and the intuitions that derive out of a study of scripture for economic insight. I tend to agree with Keith that it's not really big government versus big business, but really small versus large. And as much as possible, we should reduce the size of institutions, because any institution, whether it's economic or political or religious or academic or media, if it grows too large, it creates disincentive for it to serve the interests of the people that it's allegedly supposed to serve. So I would agree in that case as well. So, yeah, do you have a point you want to make, Sean?
Yes, indeed. Something that we're dancing around, and which will doubtless come up, but I claim the prerogative of raising it first, is the whole issue, or is the legal basis of big business. What in English law is called a joint stock limited liability corporation. These are based on a grant of state power, and the grant of state power is that the shareholders in these corporations are immune from, well, they have limited liability. Their liability in the event of an insolvency of the company is limited to the amount of to the value of their shareholding, or the amount of money they put into the company. This allows very large organizations to grow up, because the shareholders are not terribly worried that they will lose their houses and their life savings in the event of an insolvency. It also allows these institutions to last for very long times. You have companies like Nestle, for example, which were set up in 1869. There are companies in Britain which were established in the 1840s, which are still with us. And these contain elements of entrepreneurship. In an imperfect world, I think organizations like Tesco and Walmart do have a valid case. but in a very imperfect world. It's better to have food supply in the hands of these big businesses than directly in the hands of the state. Even so, although they contain elements of entrepreneurship, they are also, as Keith said, part of the ruling class. And when you look at the boards of directors of these big organizations, they're stuffed with ex-politicians. The boards do favors with the various bureaucratic institutions that are supposed to regulate them. And it's very difficult to disentangle these large corporations from the state. They're not a branch of the state. They are a branch of the ruling class, which is based within the state. And I think any kind of society in which we have autonomy, or in which we are self-sufficient, or in which we look to ourselves and each other for our salvation, will need to do without the institution of limited liability. And this in itself would immensely reduce the size and the longevity of these economic institutions, and would prevent much of the economy from being cornered by a branch of the ruling class.
So you're arguing for the revocation of the limited liability legal system?
Yes.
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
It was a wrong move in Britain and America in the 19th century. I'm aware of the arguments. I'm aware of the arguments used to set it up. Richard Cobden, for example, someone for whom I normally have a great deal of time, believed that limited liability would allow small people to gather together to set up economic organizations. Well, it might do that, but we are now 150 years into this experiment, and it has led to the growth of these gigantic global corporations, which are effectively or actually part of the ruling class. And limited liability should be abolished. Now, whether you make the shareholders jointly and severally liable for the debts of their corporations, or whether you announce that the directors are the actual owners and that they are jointly and severally liable, that's a contingent question. But the abolition of limited liability, I think, it should be part of the core libertarian, or part of the core anti-ruling class project.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Keith or Will, you have anything to add to Sean's insight here?
Yeah, I could add a few things to that. One is that in order to understand how the modern system of state capitalism developed, it's necessary to go back and trace its roots. And Kevin Carson has done a very good job of tracking the history of how modern state capitalism actually developed, in the sense that the way that it developed was essentially the old aristocratic classes, at least in certain parts of the world, the old feudal elites, largely reinvented themselves as a type of new ruling class. They reinvented themselves as a capitalist class during the time that the Industrial Revolution was taking place. So the idea that when industrial civilization was developed, the idea that it resulted in a total transformation of society in the sense that power relations were totally altered, I think is not as a point of view that can be defended as well as some people seem to think it can. A parallel issue is that if we actually look at the legal infrastructures that are associated with state capitalism, of the type that Sean is describing, like limited liability, we see that in the United States, much of that was enacted largely by means of the courts. We can actually go back and find American court decisions from the 19th century where things like corporate personhood were largely created by judicial fiat. One thing that's interesting is that in the United States, we have a lot of political conservatives who decry judicial activism, that is, judges stepping above the bounds of the written law and largely writing their own views into the law from the bench. But that's precisely how the whole system of corporate personhood developed back in the 19th century, largely through judicial fiat, not through an act of Congress or state legislation or anything of that nature. Another issue that I think is extremely important is what might commonly be called corporate welfare. There was an interesting article in Forbes magazine, which is a leading American business magazine, a few months ago, talking about how of all of the what they call developmental aid, what they really meant is welfare given to corporations for purposes of R&D and things like that. Virtually all of it had gone to about 900 corporations over the last 40 years. And essentially the American elite, in terms of the corporate branch of the elite, consists of about 1,000 to 1,500 major corporations that control most of the major industries and occupations. So at every different layer, we see that the state plays a role in centralizing control over wealth. In the United States, for example, at the federal level, we see a wide range of federal policies and legislations that have this effect. We see that at the state and local level as well. If you look at the way in which the economic policies of local governments are organized, I have some familiarity with this because I was involved in city politics in my city some years ago. And what I found is that things like zoning laws, property use regulations, building codes, parking, eminent domain, all of these kinds of things are used to essentially provide assistance to large and politically connected corporations that want to, say, use someone else's land for the purpose of building a parking lot, or regulating businesses with licensing requirements or tax requirements that become cost prohibitive to small competitors, or restricting the use of the development of housing in particular areas in order to artificially inflate the value of the local real estate and things like that. This kind of thing exists at every different level in the whole state system. So it's important to consider the way in which what's commonly called capitalism or big capital or whatever is dependent upon the state in just about every aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, one interesting element of modern economics is the way it's reduced man to a sort of servile condition. Aristotle once described a slave as a living tool. And one of the things that we, as a preface to this, in ancient and medieval economic models, there was the concept called instrumentality, which said that the tool used by the craftsman or the soldier or whatever was seen as an extension of the individual. So it was difficult to abstract the idea of a sword away from the soldier, the knight, or extracting the hammer away from the blacksmith, or the saw from the carpenter. And they were seen as an extension of the individual. So the individual was prior and superior to the machine, which served the individual's interests. Much like when Christ said, the Sabbath is, man is not for the Sabbath, but Sabbath is for man. But with the rise of industrialization, what's ended up happening is that individuals, which are seen as humans, which are seen as fungible, interchangeable cogs in a machine, they try to treat us as much like that as possible, does literally reduce us to living tools, which is interestingly Aristotle's definition of a slave. And I think it's this dehumanization of the way industrial processes work. I don't think it's necessarily inherent to industrialization, but it's the current course that's been taken. And I think that leads to a lot of social and economic dislocation. In fact, that kind of economic and social dislocation, strangely enough, Marx was supportive of, because he viewed that as a stage of breaking down feudalism to get us to socialism.
Yeah, sorry, does Will want to say something?
I don't think so.
Sure, I could say something.
Go ahead.
We're talking a lot about big business and big government. I think there's a strong relationship between the two, such that you can't really necessarily separate the two. And one problem I see, or that I perceive at least, is that government is fulfilling a kind of ecological or evolutionary niche, and that it might be the application of law at its ideal firm size, a sort of natural monopoly. And if we want to have smaller institutions, I think we have to address this and recognize that government, large government, is keeping up the large business. We have to create an institution that fills that same ecological niche on the same scale, but that better facilitates the kind of institutions that we want.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Oh, just picking up on something that Keith said about the transformation of the feudal ruling class into the capitalist class. I think that's one of the few areas in which I disagree with Keith. If I look at my own country, which is the one I know best, obviously, what you'll see is that classical feudalism never really took hold in England, and the feudalism that did develop after the 11th century was effectively dead by the end of the 15th century. And we come into the early modern period, the Tudor period, with a surprisingly modern and economically mobile society. I'm not romanticizing it, but I'm just saying that. And the last institutions of feudalism were all abolished in 1641 and 1660, after which the aristocracy in this country no longer had a feudal basis. It was largely based on the ownership of property, with which I'm sure other people will take issue, and a certain social prestige. And I personally have no objection to our long period of aristocratic hegemony in England that opened, shall we say, in 1660 and ended in about 1914. It led to a practical and long-term limitation of the state. And one of the main reasons why government grew so much in England after 1914 was not just the two big wars we fought, but also the replacement of an aristocratic ruling class with a ruling class made up of big businessmen, of bureaucrats, of professional experts, and the ruling class that we now face. I would be very happy to see the restoration of the aristocratic hegemony that we had before the Great War. So I take a less hostile view of the landed aristocracy than Keith does, in England at least. Once you talk about landed aristocracies in places like South America and Central Europe, it becomes a very different matter. But the main enemy, however it got there and whatever its ancestors may have been, is the current ruling class. This combination of political, economic, and information power.
Yeah. One very interesting economic insight comes from Oswald Spengler in his Decline of the West. He makes the connection that capitalism, well, he makes two connections. Capitalism and communism are, they're opponents, but not in the sense that we often see them as opponents. He sees them as two sides of the same coin, where they're both trying to achieve the same end, this sort of bourgeois existence, but they differ on the means to get there. So it's, rather than two hostile enemies, it's of totally different natures. It's actually two people arguing within the same family. And he gives a historical example of how the populist movements in Rome, like the Gracchi brothers, were funded by the patricians until the reforms that they wanted to be made were completed. And then, of course, they withdraw funding from the Gracchi brothers, and they then were ultimately assassinated by the Senate. And we see in the 20th century with the research of Anthony Sutton, is that mode has been repeated with the Soviet Union. One of the long-standing myths is that the Soviet economic, quote, miracle under Stalin and the 5-year plans was the result of communism, but nothing further from the truth could be the case. It turns out that in the interwar period, there was vast amounts of investment by Western capital into the Soviet Union. Avril Harriman, who was the he had a manganese concession in the Caucasus, but also was the U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union in World War II, reports that Stalin told him that 2/3 of Soviet industry were constructed with the aid or under the direction of U.S. Engineering personnel. So it's quite interesting that, and we even see this today as well with a lot of the riots and protests today, which are controlled by big money, like the Soros groups that try to manipulate populist uprisings in a certain way. So the sort of dichotomy that we get from the Cold War, while not wholly false, is deceiving in many ways.
Yeah.
I would agree with certain aspects of that. As far as the whole dichotomy between capitalism and communism, there are people on the far right and on the far left who have this view that capitalism and communism, as they emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, were largely just two sides of the same coin. I've heard some conservative traditionalists argue that, as well as some fascist types on the right. And then on the far left, there are some left Marxists and anarchists who argue that as well. There are people on the far left, for example, like left Marxists that are influenced by thinkers like Rosa Luxemburg or anarchist syndicalists who will argue that Bolshevism was really just the left wing of the bourgeoisie. They'll argue that if you look at the communist revolutions that happened throughout different parts of the world in the 20th century, that the leadership and organizers of these movements tended to come from the educated classes. Very rarely were these actual peasant and worker uprisings. In fact, of all the famous communist leaders from history, about the only one that wasn't a bourgeoisie by birth was Stalin. Virtually all of the others came from the middle or upper middle class. So I suppose there's a case that could be made for that. I have heard people from both the far left and the right interpret communism in that way. But the other thing, though, is that I think that one issue that needs to be considered is the role of global institutions. What we've been talking about so far deals primarily with national institutions and how modern state capitalism, or whatever we want to call it, developed in different countries in America or England or wherever. But at the same time, international institutions and organizations have always played a role in the development of modern state capitalism and modern economics generally. And Todd alluded to that a little bit when he talked about Anthony Sutton's research into Western investment in the Soviet Union and things of that nature. But right from the onset in the early modern period, when we see the rise of the modern industrial market economy, we start to see the role of international banking houses and things like that playing an essential role as well. And particularly since the end of the Cold War, we started to see the institutions of capitalism expand on an international level to where capitalism has essentially become transnational in many ways. And we have the individual nations essentially being a type of set of constituents for international economic institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the G20, all of these different, the UN, all of these different kinds of international organizations that facilitate and manage international trade. So I think that that's really where things are headed now, where national ruling classes are largely becoming constituent parts of this kind of global system.
Yeah. Could I take a less bleak view of the present order of things? Without necessarily rejecting the proposition that capitalism and communism are two sides of the same coin, what I would say is that if you compare the outcome of each system, they are radically different. Was it by their fruit shall ye know them? Soviet communism and every system that was recognizably similar to Soviet socialism simply produced mass hardship, either mass starvation, as in the Soviet Union and particularly in Ukraine, or just a rather dreary mediocrity, which you saw in East Germany. Whereas capitalism, you can knock the big corporations, as I do, But well, we're having this conversation because of Microsoft and Google and dozens of other limited liability corporations, and you know, the main nutritional problem many of us face is that we're not hungry, but we're perhaps a little less hungry than we might profitably be. And so we are kicking against a system which can fairly be described as the most productive and the most successful in history. I'm sure that we can do better, but the system itself is, by all previous standards, a miracle.
Well, I tend to agree with that. One reason I could never really be a true conservative or a true reactionary would be that I tend to not be someone who thinks that the past is better or tends to be better. You know, I tend to think that probably 2017 is as good a time as ever to be alive as a human being. Now, that may not be true for every single person in every part of the world, but if we look at how the world is today and we compare it with history and with past societies, I think, you know, we're doing pretty well. Many of the problems that existed in more traditional societies, like serfdom, like slavery, like religious persecution, like ethnic persecution, like the traditional subordination of women, the standard treatment we saw of things like of people like, say, the mentally ill or the disabled and all of that in older societies. A lot of that has largely been eradicated. Since then, other things have come along to replace it. In the 19th century, we had the rise of classical proletarianism. And then after that, we had, while I think some of that was alleviated by economic growth and technological development, as well as labor and legal reforms. And then in the 20th century, we had the monstrosity of totalitarianism. I think that was really the biggest problem that the 20th century faced, was totalitarianism. But what we see today, I think, as being one of the primary problems is not the hard totalitarianism that we saw in the 20th century, but a type of soft totalitarianism where we may not, for example, we may not be arrested for holding this podcast as we would be in a hard totalitarian system. But we do see this kind of system where the state increasingly tries to stick its hands into everything, and we have this all-encompassing kind of bureaucratism, this kind of Kafkaesque type of system. You know, I think the way to understand modern states is to read Kafka rather than Darkness at Noon. I think with Kafka rather than Stalinism, you get a clearer picture of what's going on, and that's really what I see as one of the principal challenges that people face in modern societies: is how do we have prosperous modern societies without having the state sticking its hands into everything.
I'd like to clarify that points are well taken, Sean, that the comparison was more of a genealogical comparison rather than an outcomes-based comparison as far as capitalism and communism. And to jump off what Keith was saying, basically what you described, Keith, was the difference between 1984 and Brave New World. And Huxley correctly pointed out that the people that want to manage our lives in the future are not going to rely purely on sheer terror, because it's typically expensive and it's also inefficient, because the minute the terror goes away, people are going to want to overthrow the system. And so you have to have this constant uniform pressure all over the country, and eventually it breaks down, as we saw in the Soviet Union. Huxley, he was interviewed by Mike Wallace, I think it was in the 60s, and he said that his main concern was with the rise of modern technology and the way it can be used in the economic sphere would be to create conditions of life that, primarily through drugs. In his book, it was the fictional drug Selma. And that we would create a condition of life that we would be happy with, that we otherwise should not or would not be happy with. And that's the kind of soft totalitarianism that I think Keith is talking about. And it's the result of this, it's not purely pharmacological, but that's a key component of this soft tyranny, where people, as they say in the saying, kiss the chains that bind them. They don't even see the chains. And that's the great victory of this managerial elite, is people think that they're free when they're not really.
Though, all right, look, I've spent most of my life denouncing the police state that is my country. On the other hand, Now, I accept that there are certain things that I cannot say in my country that I could have said 20 or 30 years ago. For the first time in my life, a number of years ago, I began dropping my voice in coffee bars when having certain kinds of conversation. At the same time, I have more practical freedom of speech and more practical freedom of action than I have ever had. I can speak to whom I like. I can more or less say whatever I like, because I'm not the kind of person who does not watch his words. You can state almost any opinion so long as you express it in the approved way. And I do have the ability not to drop out, but I do have the ability to avoid being too entangled in the large corporate institutions that I denounce. I make money from them, but I make money as an outsider. And that is something which in the past would have been much harder than it is today. It may be that anyone listening to this conversation in 20 or 30 or 50 years' time will be fully aware of how the runaway technological developments that we've seen during the past 30 years would eventually bring about a new and much better order of things. It may be that larger organizations like Google and Microsoft and Dell and HP and all those other big IT organizations are ultimately liberating us. They're making huge amounts of money from us in the meantime. They're using intellectual property laws in all sorts of unacceptable ways. But the bottom line is that they have given us weapons of enormous power with which we can stand up for the protection of our lives, liberties, and properties. That's one way of looking at it.
Yeah. Will, do you have anything to add on this conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to address the original topic of communism and capitalism being two sides of the same coin. For me, that's very much true, and the reason for that is that they both separate the product of labor from the laborer. In the case of capitalism, that product is taken for the landlord or the boss or the usurer, and in the case of communism, it's taken for a community that I've been involuntarily associated to. And in that sense, I feel that the two have very much in common, even though they end up distributing those things very differently. Communism will tend towards a shortage because everything ends up being consumed by everyone, whereas capitalism tends towards a surplus where everything is stored and stored into a glut by the capitalist landlord and boss, who really, they don't have the power to consume everything. So capitalism provides us an economy that's very productive and produces a lot of things that are very poorly distributed, while communism provides us an economy where things don't really get distributed or don't really get produced too well, but they get distributed probably too much. I think that's that's something to think about in terms of how the two relate to each other.
Yeah. Keith, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I actually have a question for Will about Georgist economics. I first heard of Georgism probably about 28, 29 years ago when I was first becoming interested in anarchism as a philosophy, and I became interested in a lot of these alternative economic ideas like syndicalism and mutualism and things like that. And I remember coming across Georgism. But what I'm not quite sure about is how would Georgism and anarchism be reconciled? Because as I understand it, under the theories of Henry George, land is essentially a public trust, which means that individuals are obligated to pay a kind of tax on land that they're not obligated to pay on things like, say, incomes or the improvements they make on land. So without a state, who exactly would collect this tax? Or am I just totally misunderstanding the theory? Like, I mean, who would attack the who would collect the single tax that George advocated for?
Okay, that's a good question. Many Georgists don't feel that the single tax is rightly called a tax because it's more of a matter of compensation for people usurping and privatizing the commons. So if you look at it that way, it's not really a tax, but it is an issue of justice. And the issue of justice should probably be applied by a community that functions in more or less a social anarchist manner with participatory decision-making and things like that. As far as how this could be established in anarchist fashion, I think if we take, say, the non-aggression principle, which is something that really Benjamin Tucker touched on long before Murray Rothbard or anyone else, but if we apply that rigorously and we look at two individuals who are homesteading land, we can see that those individuals, as soon as they leave their homestead to go on vacation or do something else, under, just not being having it under their possession, it can be squatted by someone else. And so my idea is that if, in order for these people to secure their properties, they're going to need to bargain with each other to respect each other's properties in each other's absence. And the most reasonable terms to come about doing that, I feel, is the Georgist means of sharing in the rent. And so for me, that's equal to purchasing security or something like that for one's property.
I have another question for Will, again about Georgism. In the pragmatic sense, because I'm not an anarchist, I think that the easiest tax to collect would be on land. It doesn't need an inquisition, unlike the income tax. It doesn't need an inquisition to assess and collect. But what I understand as the basic Georgist premise is that if you're a landowner, the value of your land is based on the activities of other people, and therefore your land is it's a kind of rent on the rest of society. Whereas I am not a landowner as such, but I do possess, or I have developed, certain skills which are valuable because of the efforts of other people, because other people have earned the money to be able to afford my services. I'm able to sell them and make a profit. Now, what is the difference between me as, let's say, a classics teacher and a landowner who collects rent on his land?
I guess the main difference there would be that the landowner is collecting the rent as a form of collecting the collective production of the population. Like you're saying, a population will add value to a given location. An individual doesn't necessarily do that in the same way, and at least it's much more competitive. Whereas a population, it will tend to have laws that apply, such as Hotelling's law, which is the law that describes why you'll find two gas stations across the street from each other. Each of those gas stations surely provides value to the location, but independent of that location, independent of each other, they don't provide as much value. When they follow Hotelling's law and they set up location next to each other, the location, actually even before they set up, the location has that value. So it's more of a collective matter rather than an individual one.
Yes, I don't actually have a lot of competition. I'm one of half a dozen people in my county who can provide these particular services, and I find that the demand for my services and the income that I derive from them is very much determined by the general level of economic activity of other people within my county. Now, I don't regard my income as in any sense illegitimate, and so if I were to own a piece of land which suddenly became valuable because large numbers of people wanted to live near it or indeed on it, what is it that is so necessarily unjust about that? I'm not arguing, I'm simply asking a question of somebody who is an expert on the matter.
Right, I understand. The real injustice would just be that you're controlling land that has value, which isn't due exclusively to your behavior or activity. And so, you know, I would suggest that that would be unjust on those grounds.
Mm-hmm. I'm willing to accept, as I said, pragmatically, if we must have taxes, and I think we must, then they are better levied on land or a tax on rents, or some kind of racing system, than with the vast inquisitorial system of income tax, value-added tax, and all the other things. But I'm not convinced by arguments about the inherent injustice of land ownership. Oh, sorry, a reservation. If, as in some South American countries until the recent past, or perhaps even in the present, land is owned, virtually all the land in the country is owned by 300 families who run the place, a giant cartel, then there is a good case for breaking up those land holdings. But I don't see anything inherently unjust or illegitimate about simply owning a piece of land and drawing rent from it.
Okay, so what if we approached it more from a grounds of egoism, and we consider that there's lots of people who want that land, and that justice is something that is a reflection of people's egoism rather than something to constrain it. And if we look at it that way, then it's not so much an issue of justice, as how are you going to control that land and keep it from all those people that want it. And I think the most stable, the best means of reaching an equilibrium that would satisfy everyone would be to share out the rent, and that would get rid of all that competition, all those negative feelings about who's holding on to what kind of land.
Okay, to interject here, we're nearing the end of the hour, so as maybe we should end some final statements. Well, we can start with Keith, Sean, and then Will. So, do you want to end with anything, Keith?
Yes. I think that one thing that I would add to the conversation about how to go about defining legitimate ownership of property and control over resources is that I also think a lot of this is culturally constructed, in the sense that different societies develop different kinds of norms about what constitutes just property rights or just forms of economic exchange, in the same way that they develop different ideas about table manners or marital customs or things of that nature. I mean, if we look at different societies around the world, we see societies have all sorts of norms and folkways and mores and taboos concerning all kinds of things, from food to sex to family relations to styles of dress and consuming alcohol. And I think in many ways, what are commonly called property rights or ownership rights are rooted in that. These things are cultural constructs that are derivative of the particular circumstances that people find themselves in at particular times, and they're just trying to come up with something that works for them. So I suppose I would be somewhat of a relativist when it comes to these kinds of questions, in the sense that what works for some people may not work for other people, or what may be best in some circumstances may not be best in other circumstances.
Yeah. So, Sean, do you have anything you want to end with?
Yes. I believe in free enterprise. I believe in free enterprise, partly because I know which side I stand on in the economic calculation debate, but also because I believe that free enterprise allows people to live what can be broadly called the good life. Even so, I'm not an anarchist, and I do believe in nations, and I do believe in nation states, and I do accept that there may be situations or there may be circumstances in which it is necessary for the public good for the state to interfere. Now, the manner of that interference needs to be guided by our general understanding of economics. To come back to a point I keep on making, it is a very bad idea for the state to control the price of bread or to control the price of labor in any particular market. It's a bad idea for the state to direct investment. It's a bad idea for the state generally to pick winners, as they sometimes say in this country. But that is not to say that all state interventions are inherently illegitimate. So I suppose I come back with a rather moderate, conservative position. Plenty of freedom of enterprise, and also a small but effective state which takes action for the public good.
Okay. Will, do you have anything you want to end with?
Yeah, I think a lot of the disagreements that people have in political and economic discussions end up being largely semantic, and so having these kinds of roundtable discussions with people with different views ends up being very important. One example I can think of is when I was being asked about Georgism and rent. Those were perceived as questions about actions of a state, but even if you could describe it in terms of a state, I don't necessarily feel those are state actions. And so I take the view more like Gustav Landauer, that statism is a behavior rather than an institution. And so if we can break down those kinds of behaviors, I feel like that's the most important thing, and that we do that best by interacting with people who disagree with us and coming to terms with that and reasoning with each other. So I appreciate having these discussions.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for having on. This is Todd Lewis signing off.